Hi everyone, and welcome to the second video in biological molecules, and we're going to be looking at water here. Water is by far the most basic biological molecule, and as we saw previously, it consists of a molecule that looks like this. One hydrogen, single bonded to a single oxygen, single bonded to another hydrogen. Now, I got bad news. This is the simplest it gets, so you better pay attention here. But also, luckily, it has a few interesting properties that enable us to live the life that we do and exist in the way that we do. And I included this picture of really overly enthusiastic people drinking water because I thought it was pretty funny. I mean, who drinks water? Okay, whatever. So, first thing. The main property of water that we care about in biology, the main thing that influences its biological roles, is the fact that it can form hydrogen bonds. Now, as we talked about last week, this means we have a slightly negative oxygen over here, which we label delta negative, a slightly positive hydrogen over here, which we label delta positive, and that's because the negative electrons are sitting closer to the oxygen, and this can form a kind of bond, a very weak bond at that, very weak compared to covalent bonds, but a bond nonetheless, to kind of adjacent water molecules that are doing the same thing. Because these hydrogen bonds are attracted, these hydrogen atoms are attracted to these oxygen atoms. When we call this a hydrogen bond. And you've got to remember, it's between the delta positive hydrogen and the delta negative oxygen. This symbol is called delta and it then means slightly. So this is a hydrogen bond, and this is really important. Why is it important? I'll draw a better rectangle than that. Why are hydrogen bonds important? Well, it means that water has a number of properties that we care about. I'm going to talk about properties over here. And a lot of these properties are kind of due to the fact that it has these hydrogen bonds, which means that the molecules are attracted to each other. The first one that I'm going to talk about is that water is a really good solvent. What does this mean? The fact that water is a good solvent means that it can dissolve other things. It means it can kind of carry other things in a solution of water. A solution consists of a solvent, in this case water, and a solute, which, can be whatever's dissolved in the solvent. So, for example, table salt dissolves very readily in water, but oil doesn't. But on the whole, water is a good solvent, and we're going to see the use of that later. It's also fairly reactive, so it's used as a reactant. This is because it has this oxygen atom, which is kind of fairly reactive, and it doesn't have any double bonds, and double bonds are pretty stable, so, oxygen, fairly reactive molecule. Sorry, water is a fairly reactive molecule. The next thing is that it has these two properties called adhesion and cohesion. Now, because these water molecules are attracted to each other, it means that they kind of pull each other along. So if I have one molecule, and I've kind of got another one that is attached to it, and we've got a hydrogen bond over here. If I pull this one upwards, say, then this other one gets pulled along with it, because they kind of stick together in this way. And this property of them sticking together is called cohesion. Sticking together. So if you ever see the word cohesion, just think that water molecules stick together. And we're going to see that that's really useful. And we also have adhesion, which means that water molecules stick to surfaces. So say I've got a surface like this. Water molecules tend to stick to it, once again, because they can form hydrogen bonds with the surface. And so they kind of get drawn up the surface. And that's why we see, if we have a narrow tube, we see the waters get kind of gets drawn up the walls to form a meniscus. So you kind of expect the water level to be flat, but it's not. The water level gets drawn up the walls like this. that's called a meniscus, and that happens because of adhesion. So adhesion sticking to walls or surfaces. Cohesion is sticking to each other. The other thing that results from these hydrogen bonds is a high specific heat capacity. This means that to warm up some water, it takes quite a lot of energy, and this will become really important as we look at water in the context of a coolant like sweat. And kind of conjugate with this, a very related property is high latent heat of vaporization. You're going to remember this: latent heat of vaporization. And what this means is that it requires quite a lot of heat energy to turn liquid water into gaseous water. And you'll see that if you ever heat water up in a pan, it requires quite a long time. It doesn't just do it readily. And if you look at other pretty small molecules like carbon dioxide or hydrogen, they're all gases at room temperature. Water is actually a liquid at room temperature, and this is because of this high latent heat of vaporization. So this means it's a liquid at room temperature. And the high specific heat capacity means that it takes a lot of energy to heat up. You're going to denote energy E. Takes energy to heat. And there are two more kind of properties that don't really fit with the fact that it's hydrogen, that it forms hydrogen bonds, but become really useful in its biological role. And this is the fact that it's transparent. And the fact that it's less dense as ice. Now, usually when stuff gets colder, it becomes more dense. And this is even true for liquid water. Hot liquid water is less dense than cold liquid water. But when water forms ice is actually less dense. And so that's why you see that ice floats to the top of a glass of water rather than sinking to the bottom in the same way that a rock might. And we're going to see that because it's less dense as ice, it means it forms a really good insulating layer for organisms that live underwater. So say I'm a fish. This is my poor rendition of a fish. And I'm living underwater. I'm here to teach you biology, not art, so don't get too annoyed. Now, if it was pretty cold out there, it's minus 10 degrees, and water started forming ice along the surface, and it just kind of fell down willy-nilly, then firstly I'd be getting hit with ice all the time, and also the water would be continually forming ice, and I'd be getting lots of stacks of ice in the bottom of the river, and that would be a really big problem for me because the river is where I live. But actually what happens is the ice floats at the top. The ice floats like this, and it means that the water underneath stays pretty warm. So if I'm a fish, and it's cold outside, the water can actually stay pretty warm, and that means that I have a really good habitat. And that also links into the fact that the water is transparent, which helps it be a good habitat. It wouldn't be very helpful if I couldn't see anything. So we're now going to talk about these 7 properties. These 7 properties are something that you really have to remember. And we're going to talk about how the 7 properties relate to the uses of water. Now, according to A-level biology, OCR specifically, there are 4 types of uses of water. Water as a solvent, water as a transport medium, water as a coolant, and water as a habitat. And a really common question, and honestly a bit of a gift of a question, is describe how the properties of water relate to their uses in organisms. And here, this is what we're going to be talking about. Use as a solvent, use as a transport medium, use as a coolant, and use as a habitat. Right? And we can see, let's talk about solvent first. So let's ask ourselves, which properties are useful when it comes to think about water as a solvent? Well, firstly, the fact that it dissolves stuff, property number 1, is pretty useful. So, 1, the fact that it is in fact a solvent. So, a solvent in a biological system can be anything that we use to dissolve whatever it is that's going on in our cells. And so the fact that water dissolves a lot of stuff, it's a good solvent, is really important here. And the fact that it's a reactant is also pretty good, because it means that it can react with whatever it's dissolving and kind of break it apart and mean that it dissolves it much better. Now, it's also useful that water is very stable, and it's stable because of these properties number 4 and 5, which are the high specific heat capacity and the high latent heat of vaporization. And what that means is that water doesn't tend to evaporate or form ice or anything else like that. Kind of the conditions that you might find in an organism. And so the fact that it's stable means it's a really good solvent. It would be a real problem if the water in my cells just started evaporating. So, solvent. The solvent as a use of water. Why is it a good solvent? Well, firstly, because it dissolves lots of stuff, property number 1. Secondly, because it's a good reactant, so it can break up stuff. And thirdly, because it's very stable, properties number 4 and 5. Transport medium. Now, here the fact that it's a good solvent as well is also very useful, property number 1. If you have a look back here, property number 1. Because it means that if I use water as a transport medium to transport ions or cells around my body like I do in my blood, it's very useful, the fact that I can dissolve stuff in my blood. So I dissolve lots of CO2 in my blood, and that's part of how I breathe out CO2, and we'll talk about that later. But the fact that it's a solvent means that it can carry lots of stuff, so it's a very useful transport medium. Here, the fact that we have adhesion and cohesion is also super duper important. So when I think about a plant, the way that plants transport water up and down, and they transport a lot of ions in the water as well, is using a transpiration stream. And we're going to talk about the transpiration stream. But importantly, when we have a big long tree, stuff needs to get pulled up the tree, and the way that it's pulled up is by evaporation from the leaves of the tree, which pulls the next kind of waters along so that they can evaporate, and that means that the whole stream of water is pulled up all the way up the tree by this cohesion. And if you get a straw, what you'll actually find is that you can only ever draw up water just by kind of sucking it up about 10 meters. That's the absolute maximum by the laws of physics for how far up you can get water up a straw. But since we see trees that are much higher than 10 meters tall, we know that there's something else that needs to be going on here. And what is going on is this adhesion and cohesion. So water sticks to the sides of the walls of how the tree transports water in what's called the xylem. So water sticks to the side of the xylem, and it gets pulled up by adhesion and cohesion. And there's a special word for when we have water in a very thin tube and it gets pulled up along the walls, and this is called capillary action. So if I put a thin tube in a kind of bath of water like this, we'll actually see that water gets pulled up here, and we call this capillary action. And that's something that goes along with these adhesion and cohesion properties, and that's something that's very useful for water as a transport medium. Capillary action. Okay, so next up we've got water. Oh, sorry. I'm not quite done with water as a transport medium. So carrying on, going through the list. It's useful that water has a high specific heat capacity and a high latent heat of vaporization, because you don't want your transport medium to kind of start evaporating on you. And the fact that it's transparent and less dense as ice isn't really important here. Water as a coolant is when this high specific heat capacity and high latent heat of vaporization become really important. Now, they were important in the previous things as a solvent or a transport medium, because, it means that the water is fairly stable or inert. But if I want a coolant, then it's really important that it requires a lot of energy to heat it up, because that means that it's going to take a lot of energy as it is heated up. So when I'm sweating, as the sweat on on the surface of my skin heats up, it's drawing a lot of heat energy away from the rest of my body. So that's really important, and that's due to number 4, the high specific heat capacity. And similarly, as the sweat evaporates, that takes a lot of heat to evaporate the sweat, and that's number 5, the high latent heat of vaporization. And what this means is that between these two things, between the high latent heat of vaporization and the high specific heat capacity, water takes a lot of energy to heat up and evaporate, and it makes a very effective coolant. And that's really important because we see water used as a coolant throughout all kinds of animal life. And so these properties are really, really key. And finally, water as a habitat. Now, we already talked about how number 7 was super important and less dense as ice, because it means it forms an insulating layer. We've talked about how it's transparent. That's very important for water as a habitat because it means that, you know, anything that wants to see can see. Number 4 and 5 are important because it means it's a very stable place to be. Reminder that that's high specific heat capacity and high latent heat of vaporization. And number 1 is pretty useful as well, the fact that it's a solvent, because it means that it can dissolve things like oxygen in it. So if I'm a fish, I can breathe underwater because water is a solvent, so it dissolves oxygen. So we see that hydrogen bonds here really dictate these properties. All these properties are more or less due to the hydrogen bonds, the solvent because it can break stuff apart using the hydrogen bonds, the adhesion and cohesion because water molecules are attracted to things due to the hydrogen bonds, the high latent heat of vaporization because water molecules are hard to take apart because of the hydrogen bonds, which means that it takes quite a lot of energy to break them apart and turn them into a gas, and so on and so forth. So hydrogen bonds dictate these properties, and in turn these properties dictate these uses in biological systems. So that's really what we have to think about when we're talking about water. And I'm going to give just a couple of examples, and then I'm going to call it a day. I'm going to move my nice drawing of capillary action down here. So examples of uses as a habitat, we've already talked about fish. Examples of uses as a coolant, we've already talked about sweating. Examples of uses as a transport medium, we've already talked about how plants use water as a transport medium when they're drawing stuff up the xylem, and how it's really important that we have capillary action there, and that's due to this adhesion and cohesion. So transport medium, example plants. And transpiration, and maybe you'll remember some of that from GCSE. And finally, an example of its use as a solvent is we see in bacterium. In bacteria, we see that the cytoplasm is actually made or consists a little bit of water, and so it's used as a solvent, and it's used as a site of chemical reactions. Might include here that the fact that it's a solvent means that it can be a site of chemical reactions. And that's more or less all I have to talk about for water. So key things to remember with water. Water forms hydrogen bonds. The hydrogen bonds give it these 7 properties that we should really try to remember. And the 7 properties are useful for these 4 main uses in biological organisms, and you can think about which properties are useful for each of these uses. All right, that's all I've got for today. Thanks for listening, and see you in the next video, which will be about carbohydrates.